happening? Normally, I'd be loving this kind of thing. You know, everywhere I turn there's a scoop. But none of that matters if you're not alive to tell it. Besides, mayhem has become the way of life here.
Okay, so I think that you can safely say that I'm going to be adding reviews to every one of Resident Evil Outbreak's bosses. Don't worry, it's not going to be a really long series. This game has 4 boss fights in total, if I'm remembering correctly, because each of the missions was supposed to end with a boss fight except for the first one, and there's only 5 levels in the entire game, so that's just what it is. It's Resident Evil Outbreak. And what the giant leech boss fight is, and the reason why I want to talk about it, is it's a massive failure of marrying the design concept to the gameplay concept, because mostly the big problem is lack of information available to the player, because this is a Resident Evil game, which is a series of games that has never been able to tell the player if they are accurately shooting the zombies in front of them up until the first-person shooter games or Resident Evil 4. Depending on how you're playing the series, if you're playing everything it has to offer. The problem with this is that the giant leech's weak spots are environmental details, which is a great idea for getting this done, because forcing the player to stand in one spot and just take pot shots at an environmental object until it explodes while the boss is encroaching on where they're standing is an amazing idea full of potential for creating suspense, which is very important for a horror game, especially if they have these saving issues that Resident Evil Outbreak has. The problem is that the environmental details take so much damage to actually activate the thing that you're trying to get them to do, and the total lack of information on whether or not you're actually hitting the thing you're aiming at means that what once had the potential to be an element producing suspense for this boss fight ultimately becomes not only completely pointless, but also a huge liability to the player themselves. And what pisses me off more about this was that Capcom, or whoever in Capcom's teams made this boss fight, failed at this multiple times. Because not only do you get the first valve in the hallway attached to the ceiling to release its acid or its fire to damage the giant leech, you also supposedly get some sort of battery or motor or air conditioner on the bridge that could also do the job if you hit that enough, which is even harder to hit than the valve, and the valves aren't actually the easiest thing in the world to hit, and they, again, take so many bullets that why the hell are you standing around? It takes so long to shoot these goddamn things that by the time the giant leech is there to actually get hit with the stuff, it's already gone past where the valve is and become a completely pointless liability because you lost so much ground to the giant leech just by standing there and waiting for it to show up. And yeah, you could tell me, well, what you were supposed to do was shoot up the valve before the leech got there, and wait until it starts spouting effects to show that you're dealing damage to the valve, but my response to that would be, it's more user-friendly and more logical that this is just a valve, okay? And in this weird cinematic universe physics thing that Resident Evil plants its flag in, it would be more logical in this science fiction scenario for the player to shoot the valve maybe less than 4 times and then it erupts and completely breaks down. This isn't a realistic game where the valve would be competently constructed and would take a dozen bullets for it to be broken completely. What Resident Evil is a universe that's set more in the action movie sense of physics instead of our realistic physics. And there are small and huge details across the franchise that can attest to the fact that it's motioning more towards action movie physics. Because things break really easily. Monsters are getting released all the time. This isn't a franchise where you could realistically expect that things are going to be so competently constructed that the idea that you would have to stand there and do preliminary damage before the giant leech shows up would actually be a tactic in a long-standing player's time. And I'm mostly saying that to counter the claim of people thinking I'm being stupid by saying, oh, you should have been doing damage before it showed up. It's just not a thing that happens in the Resident Evil series. Players would not be thinking that because, like I said, it's also more user-friendly on the end of the player that you would shoot it 3 times and then you would be able to get the big damage bonus from shooting the valve and doing environmental damage. Because you don't know how much damage that you're supposed to do to the valve before the leech shows up, if that was hypothetically how it was supposed to go down. So it's much more sensical to stand there, wait until the leech gets to you, and then start shooting the valve. Because what if you miss? Because you were doing all this damage to the valve before it broke. And if you want to continue telling me that this wasn't how it was supposed to work, then here's something Capcom could have done. It could have shown me the structural integrity of the valve in the beginning cutscene. Okay, you could have shown in the cutscene if the valve was easily breakable or it would have taken forever to break. Have in some way the leech show up, maybe have it smack a valve on the wall, hit it once or hit it 3 or 4 times, and then you establish how the valve is supposed to work. The thing that's not even justifiable is the bridge detail on the flavor text, which suggests that you can also use that as some sort of makeshift bomb to do the damage likewise. Which doesn't work because, honestly, I don't know what the hell they were going for, but I was trying to shoot the giant black box that was sitting on the bridge and I was getting nothing out of it. There was no environmental details, there were no effects coming out of it, and just no information that I was hitting it in the first place. I might have been shooting at an invisible wall for all I know. And then there's the second valve, which does the first valve thing wrong, and then it's just, like I said, a complete waste of time, which is why by the end of the boss fight I ended up at the start of the arena just having to take pot shots at the leech where I was standing there, which wasn't a perfectly good strategy, because even if you get the leech to the beginning of the hallway and you think, oh, this is a huge safety envelope, I have all this space to work with, you really don't. Because the leech, just like a Dark Souls boss that gets stuck in a wall, can still, like, just carve its way through the world geometry and still hit you for damage, and the hitbox is just really hard to figure out because you don't know how realistic it's going to play into that sort of physics system that it's got going on. If the leech is half phased through a wall, you don't know if it's going to smack into a wall, or how long the body is going to be able to register damage to the things that are standing on the platform. Ultimately, the giant leech is just a complete failure of design implementation. It has no information to offer the player, and it wants to use all these environmental details inside of the boss fight. Other than that, it's just the leech in a hallway. Like, the leech has very limited range for such a huge linear hallway. Like, this hallway could be comparable to the Gwendolyn boss fight from the original Dark Souls. That's how long this place is, and he doesn't have the range to make use of where the heck he is. So even if you don't employ any of these environmental details, all the boss fight ends up being then is just you taking pot shots at a ridiculously long range from the leech, just because you have all this goddamn space to work with. And then it just becomes completely boring. The leech is an incredibly boring fight, because all it can really do is just lash at you with its head, move very slowly, and do poison spitting damage, which, like I said, doesn't have a very good range, maybe like 5 or 10 feet in front of it. All I can say is that I'm thankful that miraculously some of my allies actually survived to the final boss of the mission, so they were able to free basically human shields while I worked on the whole leech problem. I do appreciate that, and I found it kind of hilarious that one of my allies turned into a leech monster during the boss fight because they were too stupid to actually contribute any combat damage to the leech itself. It's not a good boss, and definitely it should have been ironed out. The concept should have been rewritten. The environmental details should have been upgraded. Something should have been done through this Capcom team that made this, rather than how it stands as it stands, because how it stands is completely confusing and possibly more overcomplicated than it really should have been, considering how little detail the game has in trying to inform the audience of the mechanics that it's trying to use.